Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. I'm your host, Kim MacDonald, and today our guest is Dr. David Daniels. David is the host of the Psych Health and Safety United States podcast. And so this is a special episode where we're doing a crossover. I'm a guest on his podcast, and he's a guest on mine.
From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
David, it's great to have you with me here kind of in Canada and from the United States Psych Health and Safety in the US podcast. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim. It's an honor and a privilege. Thanks.
And it is a great idea that I give you for full credit for getting us to have these conversations to share and dig a little deeper into what may be similar and what may be the same across the border between Canada and the US in these topics that we talk about on the podcast. So I have my first question, which I'm going to pose two questions. So I've added in your question that you posed to guests as the second one as well. But I want to get you to share with our listeners and with me the answer to your very wonderful question, which is, who is David Daniels?
So David Daniels so first of all, there's a reason why I don't use my first name. I do have a first name. Okay. But I didn't know it was my first name until I was in the second grade because my mom had never used it. I am the proud son of a 14-year-old who was raised without a dad, but with six siblings, who grew up to become a firefighter and eventually a fire chief, and realized about halfway through that career that he was actually really a safety professional at heart. And I connect those because my life as a youngster and my professional life they're not different. They're just different spectrums of the same, the same kind of, helping, wanting to be a positive impact on others. That's really who I've been, from my core. And the recent, add-on of this Ph.D. in occupational health and safety kind of helps me do that, because it helps me get into rooms that I would not have gotten into if I didn't have the credential. A lot of that, and we'll talk more about, why I feel that way, but I do. I realize that I am privileged in some areas and not so privileged in others. So, and all of those things make me who I am today. And I really like me some me, and am always attempting to be a better me.
Thank you for that. That's wonderful. If you could share with our listeners a little bit about some of your work experiences in health and safety. And I know a little bit about your background and where your origins come from in the country, but to your journey through, because getting from health and safety and then moving into psychological health and safety, there is a journey there. And I'd love you to share a little more on that.
So there's definitely a journey. And as I mentioned earlier, I started my adult life in the fire rescue service. I a couple of years out of high school, went into the Seattle Fire Department, and my exposure to psychosocial hazards started well before then, but they really increased then, because I found myself in an industry where I'd never seen anyone like me in the fire rescue service until I got there. I'd never seen a Black person in the fire department or a firefighter ever before. And that was really impactful for me because the system itself wasn't necessarily designed to help me be successful. And because it wasn't designed for me to be successful, the environment exerted a lot of pressure and whatnot on me that would not have been the same had I not been a member of the African diaspora. So when I went on, the city of Seattle had what they called affirmative action, which supposedly was a way to get women and people of color into a system that they were otherwise unqualified for. What I ultimately found out was it was a way to get me into a system that I was well qualified for. But it was a way to get me in the door so I could figure that out. So again, I got in and was in a number of different positions while I was Seattle. Some of them extremely traumatic, a lot of them really, really fulfilling. And so it was the mixed bag. I saw my first human being die in front of me when I was 21 and saw my first colleague die a year later. And all of those experiences, kind of gave me this kind of, survival instinct to, how am I going to kind of get through that? Because they didn't really emphasize that. At least I don't recall them emphasize. They emphasized, what I had to do and, all these risks that I had to be able to take. But they didn't realize that they didn't emphasize the emotional environment that they would be putting me in. And so a lot of it I had to figure it out on my own. But that figuring out on my own was similar to my own upbringing. Because as I mentioned earlier, I've never met my father. So all I learned was from the women who are around me. And women tend to be, a little bit more compassionate and a little bit more in touch with their emotions and a little bit more. So I was the little boy who cried and all that type of thing. And though I was, had occasion to be bullied because of that, I found it to be a strength because I'm more in touch with my emotions than a lot of the men I was around. Speed that up into how I ended up in the safety piece. So about halfway through my fire service career, it occurred to me that my colleagues getting killed at work, I didn't understand it. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And I wanted to do what I could. I thought I could do something to make a difference. So I became a health and safety officer. Matter of fact, I was the first certified health and safety officer the Seattle Fire Department ever had. I got that certification kind of on my own because nobody there knew how to do it. So my deputy, who I was working for at the time, my deputy chief says, "Hey, can you go out and find this?" So I did and kind of created that system. I'm not sure if they still use it, but that was my first safety certification I received in 1999, became a certified health and safety specialist. But the training was really not for fire service. It was for general industry. And so I have this love of health and safety because it helps me to process some of the trauma associated with all the people that I've seen get killed at work. I can list 20 or 22 people, maybe 20, late teens, 20 of people that I work with who either got killed at work or who died from something they were exposed to at work, or I believe that their suicides are connected to the work. And if I really run the numbers out, I could probably go a little bit further, but those are the ones that I can go find on the Fallen Firefighters Memorial in Emmitsburg, Maryland. So that's where I come to this discussion about psychological health and safety, because until I started my research to complete my dissertation, I didn't know it was a thing, because in the U.S., it's not something we talk about. So I started to realize that there's this whole conversation going on around the world about psychological health and safety. And I just fell in love with the concept. And so now that's really where I put a lot of my energy, not only in the podcast, but in my business. I try to help folks here in the U.S. understand that psychosocial hazards are a thing, and they are just as, and in some cases, more important to focus on than physical hazards.
I know that you know that it is a journey of learning and education to help people start to accept that and understand it and dig more into it. Maybe that is a good segue into the question of what does psychological health and safety mean to you?
So psychological health and safety means to me, and similar on, on part one of this conversation where you mentioned the
Yes.
three stools.
Yes, or three legs on the stool. The three-legged stool.
Yeah.
Three-legged stool.
I believe similarly that psychological safety is a thing, psychosocial hazards are things, and psychological health and safety are the system to manage the first two. Mm-hmm. I am so really, happy to have stumbled across, Amy Edmondson's research on psychological safety. I'm really excited to see how it's a fad. So many people are talking about it. Oh, we really want psychological safety. I think it's important. But what I also realize is, or my view is that a lot of people who get the fad don't get that sometimes you can end up with psychological safety almost accidentally. Because if you get a group of homogeneous people, we all think alike, see the world alike, of course it's going to be psychologically safe for us because we do the things that we enjoy. We design the system, we create privileges for ourselves, and it's wonderful for us. However, because we don't monitor, that part two, psychosocial hazards, or the definition in my research is a psychosocial hazard is a psychosocial factor that's perceived or experienced by the person exposed as a threat that in turn affects their behavior. It's a little bit more broad than the multiple countries, and I think I found about 11 different definitions around the world. They're all very similar, but slightly different. Mine's a little bit more generic, and it says that a psychosocial hazard affects I feel it's a threat to me. You may not, but I do. And that perceived threat causes me to act in a way that I wouldn't if that hazard wasn't there. So psychological safety plus psychosocial hazard exposure creates problems for psychological safety because you won't stay psychologically safe long term. You won't, because you've not eliminated the source of the hazard, the thing that's causing me to act that way. And that's where psychological health and safety comes in, because that's the systemic programmatic approach to how do we address the psychosocial hazards so we can end up with the psychological safety we say we want.
And psychological safety that is I think the most positive in that it can support inclusion, diversity, differences, and all those other kinds of things. So yes, I love that you began it with a cautionary tale about the psychological safety. That is a wonderful piece of the conversation, and your conversation around the similarity. Obviously, it reduces conflict. It does all these kinds of things where we do feel safe to say what we think in that environment. So we need to understand more that it's deeper if we have these other goals and there are other risks embedded in that we can't take it and think that we've done it if we're only looking for psychological safety.
That's right.
Because we need to kind of explore it a much more rich and deeper level. Thank you for that. That is, I think that's the first time I've heard it described like that. And I think that's the most, that helps. I think it really helps, David, in that, because we can get very excited about some of these terms, like mental health, in terms of having conversation. And when we hear the volume of the conversation, sometimes that can also stop us from digging deeper because we think we know. It's that danger of thinking you know the answer, and that limits your curiosity. So adding some more curiosity.
I heard recently that the enemy of learning is knowing. So there are these things that we believe we know, so we stop learning. And I, as wanting to be a lifetime learner, I am always open to maybe I don't know. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I do, but maybe I don't. There are some things that are really core to who I believe myself to be, but I'm also open that maybe some of the things that I even know about myself, there may be more there. There may be something I didn't consider. And it's not that it doesn't exist. It's that I just don't see it. And, sometimes it takes other people going like, have you considered this? And I kind of go like, oh, I hadn't considered that. I try to add that to the repertoire and, then move on from there.
It's a practice. That's, the way I hear you describing it as a practice of that, right. Of going, I think, just questioning and having curiosity about things. So I think that's a meta skill, very fundamental to the work of psychological health and safety. I would love for you to share with our listeners a bit more about or I guess we did it in part one, a little bit of going down the path of your dissertation and that work and some of the origins of it and your experiences, and then how, I'd just love to hear more about that, and very interesting work. And please share a little bit. Sure.
So first of all, my educational journey post high school took 25 years. I got a scholarship, actually a wrestling scholarship out of high school, and ended up at a small college in someplace in northern Wisconsin with a school, as I recall, that had 700 students. I'd never been on a plane before. Nobody in my family had ever been to college. So I reached out to these folks. I think, as I recall, I wasn't one of those, 5-star athletes that somebody was going to come find. So I had to go find them. And this was back in the days when even if you got an athletic scholarship, you couldn't work. Mm-hmm. So I get to this place, and 3 weeks into it, I go like, this isn't going to work because I can't feed myself. They don't give me, they say they're going to pay for my tuition and books and a place to stay, but how am I going to eat? And nobody can send me money because that would be illegal. Goodness. I can't get a job. How's that going to work out?
Oh, wow.
And so I turned around. I dropped out after 3 weeks. Oh. I picked up my education, though, after being out of high school for 10 years. I started going to community college. My associate's degree took 6 years. My bachelor's took a total of 12, so another 6. The master's took 2 years. And the only reason that happened quick is because my wife was working at the institution I was attending, and I got some benefit to her being there off the cost. So, and she was thinking about taking a new job. So she said, you need to finish because I'm not going to be here very long. And my doctorate took me 10 years. Okay. And so this gets to I started at an institution and got all the way to the point of, doing my comprehensive exams and getting ready to write a dissertation. And it's starting to fall apart there because somehow I couldn't get an advisor. Nobody would advise me. So how am I going to make this thing work? I'm supposed to figure it out on my own. And they kept fooling around. And at this time, I was of the age, I go, look, I don't want to do this. So I went ABD, or all but dissertation, for about, 3-4 years thereabouts. It was a while. And a good friend of mine, he had a similar experience. I'll do some name checking. His name is Dr. Reginald Freeman, found the institution that we both attended, Capital Technology University. I'll give them a shout out as well, that told us that they weren't going to academically haze us. So that appealed to me because I have some experience of being hazed and bullied over my lifetime. And I don't respond well in situations where people try to bully me, because here's the way I feel is that, first of all, I am an affiliate of an organization called the Workplace Bullying Institute. So I know bullying. I know what it looks like. I know, I have the, even some of the academic background about where it comes from. Those experiences actually inform my research, because I said, I want to learn a little bit more about that whole issue around bullying and all of that. And that's when I discovered the concept of a psychosocial hazard. Bullying is a psychosocial hazard. Mm-hmm. It's the one here in the U.S. we know the most about, but that's what it is. It is a family of psychosocial hazards. So that led me in my research. And I didn't want to do quantitative research because numbers, I can do them. I did fairly well at math. I just don't like it because people use numbers to justify all kinds of things. And I'm not easily convinced by your numbers. I'll give credit to Dr. Myron Golden, who suggests that people do things for one reason and one reason only, because they feel like it. And your numbers aren't going to get me to feel like it if I have enough trauma or enough history or enough built in. You can give me all the numbers in the world. I don't care because I'm not feeling it. So I wanted to do qualitative research, which is really about eliciting feelings from people and their experience. And so I did what's called a hermeneutic phenomenological approach to my research, which I took a topic that I have some relation to and wanted to learn something more about. So I didn't just pick something I knew nothing about. I picked my membership in the African diaspora. I picked the fact that I'm a safety professional in a profession where I'm rare. And that's how I did my research. And I focused on psychosocial hazard exposure, and come to find out it is one of the few studies ever done that I could find on the occupational safety and health conditions of Black workers. That got me to, so I was able to finish it and get it published. And it is one of the foundations to the work that I do now, trying to help organizations identify, assess, and mitigate the psychosocial hazards that they're exposing people to because they haven't done the first two steps.
Right. It's first things I just want to harken back to a little bit there, that the university or the educational institution being so clear and explicit about their expressing that about academic hazing, and you and your friend getting it and just there, I'm done, I'm in. That's a very amazing thing that they were expressing so clearly.
It's my belief that a lot of, onto the topic that we, have been discussing back and forth here, what goes on in the workplace. I think a lot of the issue is that employers are not honest about what the environment really is. They tell you all this flowery stuff. Oh, it's going to be wonderful. We all love each other. It's all great. We're a family, blah, blah, blah. It's going to be great. You'll love it until like day 2, when I find out that this is like, wow, this is traumatic and triggering for me. When what they should have said is, look, we do really difficult work. We value your input and feedback. We want it to be safe here, but it won't be all the time. And so we're going to give you some basic tools on how to address it when it comes up. And when it comes up, because it probably will, here's how we're going to help you. If more organizations would say that, if they would say that, look, we have not had Black people here before. We want to be an equal opportunity employer, but we're really not, because if you look around, there's all white people here, but we're going to try to make it nice for you. But they don't say that. They say, oh, it's just lovely, and ignore all the signs that say something different. And then when I experience it and I bring it up and I say something about it, well, hold up now. Then they start taking it personal. When you could have done that up front. Again, as I said, my research, I found that humans, at least the folks I talk to, are extremely adaptable if you can give them time to adapt. If you tell them up front that there's a saber-toothed tiger out in the woods, I'll find a way around the tiger. Or if you tell me that the water's deep, I'll get a boat. If you tell me it's cold, I'll adapt if I want to get something out of it. But you don't tell me that. And I have no idea what I'm getting myself into. And what I see is the amount of money that you're going to pay, or the prestige that goes along with the job. And I don't have any idea of how treacherous it's going to be, because I'm simply not prepared. And then when I have a reaction, you're not prepared either, because you turn on me instead of trying to help me.
Well, that lack of clarity and explicit communication and expectations from leaders and inside an organization is a psychosocial risk factor. It is one of the 13 factors in the Canadian National Standard for Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace. So for myself, coming from a communications background, which was my undergraduate degree, and then looking at those, communications shows up so much as one of the layers of that psychosocial factor and hazard, assessment. Communications is embedded and woven into many, many, many of them. But that clarity that you just expressed is a solution to navigating through that. And then, that it's also interesting, as you're saying, and something popped up, David, which is like that sign of respect that I'm going to tell you that we are working with this current state with aspirations of change. And so that, helping prepare you in your own readiness and accepting your, what is. That is a very, it's kind of the one of those fundamentals, human to human experience that I think is a wonderful way to flatten the hierarchy that sometimes can also be a problem, like being open and transparent and clear and explicit, as you suggested there.
Yeah, it is. I don't understand why this is so difficult, because it's really not that difficult to simply call it as it is to you. Not as it is to me, it is to you, because, I've never been in marketing, but I think a lot of marketing is trying to take something and convince people that it's good for them. And the same thing goes on in our businesses. We try to convince people that it's good for them rather than letting them decide whether it's good for them by just telling them what it is. Because what you do and the way you do it works for you. It may not work for me. And if you don't respect me enough to allow me to make my own decision about that, I'm not sure if I want to do business with you anyway. Because you and I may be in the same room, hearing the same things and seeing the same things. And if it's really psychologically safe, I should be able to say, that doesn't work for me. Mm-hmm. And you not get in your feelings. Well, what's wrong with you? There's nothing wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with you either. There's actually nothing wrong with that thing. It just doesn't work for me. So now the question is, are we really interested in psychological safety enough to allow me to be able to challenge that, as Dr. Clark talks about in the 4 stages? Can I challenge that and not get kicked out of the club? Mm. If you're really, into this safety stuff, I should be able to challenge that. And you go like, oh, and again, recognize you're never going to get it all right because you're not me. You don't know what's going on in my head. No matter how you design it, it's not going to be perfect for me. The things that are perfect for me are the things that I do for me. I told folks before, I treat myself perfectly. Everything I do for me is perfect. And that's where it stops. Because it doesn't work for everybody else. I mean, it just doesn't. And that doesn't make me a bad person or them a bad person either. It just means we are different, and it's okay to be different. And different does not mean it's deficient either.
No. As you expressed, we're talking about that is, if we're thinking about workplace culture and trying to move towards a psychologically safe culture or manage and intentionally build conditions that fit within a psychological health and safety framework. One of the interesting things about culture development and sort of focusing on that, which is a piece embedded in psychological health and safety, it is one of the 13 factors too, which is thinking about the agency that people have in the workplace. And one of the most important, it's the idea that what is your favorite, I could ask you this question, which is, what is your favorite sort of organizational behavioral theory? Self-determination is a really important one for me, and one that we use in our work, which is the understanding that people on balance know what they need and what's works for them and what's best for them. And therefore, the idea of self-determination is that if you accept that that is true, or you have a belief that that is true, then that can help to create some of those conditions. And it sort of weaves into, yes, because everyone is different. Everyone knows, and we will never know everything. So you need to have that participatory conversation,
right,
and giving people all the information they need to make those decisions is a piece of that.
It is.
And that as a cultural norm is supportive of psychological health and safety as well. So that's it does get into what are you doing and what are you not doing to build this culture, and that having that conversation early on with employees allows them to make choices that then they can decide. And so it's the idea that within culture, there's a lot of culture work that goes back to values. What are the values that we want to create for this culture? I believe that we need to go back to beliefs and assumptions. What are the beliefs and assumptions that this organization is built around? And because those are the things that are invisible in workplace cultures, typically. So that's kind of that work there. So how did you get the journey of you coming to psychological safety as an important piece of your journey for fire safety and then occupational health and safety? How did you come to be the podcast host of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast?
Well, it's similar to your experience. It's the Marianne factor. So,
thank you, Marianne.
Yeah, well, we can both blame Marianne for this. So I actually was in the process of I think I'd finished literature review and was just starting to get, to establish my research methodology for my dissertation. And this thing comes out called ISO 45003. I was thinking I was going to have to create my own instrument from scratch to be able to evaluate psychosocial hazards. And so I was, digging around trying to find something, and it popped up on my radar, and I went like, whoa. So as I got myself a copy and started to read through it, and then I saw, I don't know if it was on LinkedIn or someplace, this notification pop up that there was going to be a webinar talking about ISO 45003, and there are going to be these international experts. One was going to be from Australia, one was going to be from the UK, one was going to be from Canada. Well, come to find out, that actually was the folks over at Flourish DX, and the Australian person was Jason, and the UK person was Peter, and the Canadian person was Marianne. So I listened. So I think I had to get up at like 6 o'clock in the morning, my time, to be able to listen.
I know the working with Australians is fun, isn't it? It's like you're a Nighthawk. You are you're a Nighthawk, so more than me.
I'm a whatever it takes to get the information that I need. So I got up early and listened in and was just really enthralled by the conversation. But I felt the most kinship to the person who was closest, which is Marianne. I didn't know any of them. So I looked her up on LinkedIn basically and reached out and says, hey, I saw you on that webinar. Would you be willing to have some more conversation? She says, oh, sure. We got on the phone. It was like we were brother and sister from another mother. We talked for over an hour. Oh, and she and I have still not met in person yet. That's one of the people I just long to be able to be in the same room with at some point. But she's the one who says, yeah, you ought to reach out to the folks in Australia. They're doing some good things down there. I go, okay. So I reach out to Jason Vanchi, and we, again, same thing. It's like my brother I'd never met on the other side of the world. And actually, the nice thing about talking, I say this often, when I talk to people in Australia, I'm actually talking to the future, which I really think is very cool. So,
so true.
So we were having this conversation, and it came up literally. This is the first time we're talking. He says, you know what, mate, we've got this idea about, we've got these podcasts, and we're thinking about doing them in the U.S. And I wonder, would you be interested in hosting? I mean, literally, it's the first time I've met the guy. I go like, yeah. Do I have any idea what that means? Not a clue. Never done a podcast before. Have barely listened. I listened to a few, but I had no idea what that meant. But I go like, he's asking. I go like, well, why not? And so they sent me this box of stuff, the nice headphones and a nice, and it's been a passion ever since. I mean, I just really like it. I like the idea of being able to have these conversations. And I specifically focus on folks from the U.S., not to the exclusion of folks from around the world, but I want people in the U.S. to feel like they can relate to the people that, because if I got all the experts, I'd have very few people from the U.S. on this topic, because we're not as advanced that way. But I am finding that there are more people than I thought. As I meet one person who says, "Oh yeah, this person's doing some research, or this person has an experience," so it's a part of me now. It's a part of who I am, the host of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
It's interesting as you say that, because in mine and here, and that you're a guest on the Canadian Psych Health and Safety podcast, that too, it's the focus is on Canada, and it is obviously smaller than the world. However, the interesting thing is also exploring some of the research elements and some of the practical pieces that people are working through, and those kinds of experiences from guests is very interesting. For you, you're coming up to a milestone. So you are coming up to 1 year at being the host. So you have a number of episodes under your belt, many, many more than I do. And what is something now that you're coming up to that year? What, as you look back, had you set a goal or an intention at the beginning of doing this as the podcast host?
So as this podcast episode, the one we're recording right now, as it becomes public, I will have actually passed just slightly over a year, because part one with you and I is the second episode of the second year. So we'll be just over a year. And the one intention that I had that I was very deliberate about is the diversity of the people that I have on the podcast. Mm-hmm. I actually have a spreadsheet that I keep, and I track how many of my guests identify as male, how many identify as female, how many would look to the average person as Black or white or Asian or Hispanic. I don't kind of ask, but generally it's kind of obvious to me. So, and I kind of keep that data in the background. But I wanted to make sure that when people saw this podcast from the U.S., that it wasn't simply me and, and I'll say it, a bunch of white guys who in the U.S., white males tend to be the archetype for everything. Everything is measured by what a white male would do. And I'm obviously not white. I am male. But I also wanted to make sure that there was this diversity the numbers wise or demographically, 46% of my guests are either women or people of color. And that was very intentional. It makes it harder for me to find people because there's all kinds of, the safety profession in the United States and, around the world is not the most, diverse occupation. I started off basically with kind of people that I knew, who were kind of in this space, but always was looking for, for folks that were different. I just this vast cornucopia of different people, because what's unique is their research, expertise, or learned or lived experience around psychological health and safety. Mm-hmm. That's the part that's similar. Is that I found people who what they know about psych health and safety is what was bad in their employer. I've talked to folks who have done a depth of research on particular psychosocial hazards, have got and everything in between, activists and people who are. I tend to approach it from a occupational health and safety perspective. So I'm not a mental health provider. I'm not a therapist. I have one, but I'm not one. And so I look at it through the safety lens, where a lot of folks look at it from a mental health kind of lens, or from a therapeutic kind of lens. And all the lenses are looking at the same thing. It's, the comic book nerd in me. It's kind of like looking into the center of the multiverse or something. It's the same issue, but just comes out different directions. But it's really at its core, it's still really the same thing. So again, to your question about a goal, and I challenge most podcasts to show a more diverse population of people. And again, that's something that's very personal, based on my lived experience. That's important to me and important to my family and people like that, to be able to see themselves, in the things that I've been doing on a podcast.
That I may have to borrow that that spreadsheet view of things, because as I've started into this too, I've done that in a maybe in a less formal way, in that I typically do think that way, trying to think about those things. So thank you for that. That is good. I may just have to borrow that and get a little more formal and structured around that. As you say about the diversity and the differences and the perspectives that you went out intentionally to talk with and invite into the podcast, is there a common thread even within that whether it was, just start to show up and you notice that there is a common thread or something common even in that diversity? Was there anything that sort of emerged, I guess?
The thing that's most common is that I've gotten lots of stories about how work sucks. Really. It has been extremely difficult to find organizations who are doing it the way it probably should be done and the way we aspire it to be. Matter of fact, I can think of two guests who, I have one guest that was specifically brought on because they said the psychological environment of their employer was spectacular, and that's why they went there. One person out of over 50 guests. I have another who the space is pretty good, but what they do is they provide, some tools and whatnot to help it get better. We didn't talk a lot about what really goes on there. What I have is lots and lots and lots of experiences where there's just issues. And again, I could be depressed by that, but I'm not. What I realize is that most of these organizations were not set up to be psychologically healthy and safe. They were set up to make money, or they were set up to do whatever they do. It's not because this topic, and we talked about this, in part one, we're learning so much, particularly in the last 10 years and particularly the last 3 or 4, as the pandemic has kind of ravaged the world. We've just learned so much about it that when these organizations were started, they weren't set up to be this way. And again, I say that to not come across as being a basher of employers. I'm not saying employers are all horrible. I'm saying don't tell people that it's psychologically safe when it was never designed to be. Mm-hmm. And then what we're trying to do is kind of fix what was designed to be another way. You can't. We need new things. We need organizations to be willing to say, look, we're going to start over. We're going to start with you all in the room. How do we redesign this place so it can be psychologically and safe and healthy for all of us? And we should be doing that redesign, I'd say every year. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that's not going to change everything about the organization because you can't stay in business. But every time you bring a new person into that group, every time, we should be thinking about how do we now create something that's going to work for us to do the work that we want to do. It's all about us. It's not about the three people who started it 57 years ago. Our founder, whose picture's on the wall, who's, again, is probably some old white dude, in at least our country, because women weren't given the opportunity to start things. You know,
we have
people of
lots
color.
of that. We have lots of that too.
Yeah.
We can share in that
Absolutely.
the origin story. Yeah.
Absolutely. So indigenous people were, tossed over to the side, and Asian people, whoever. But again, we're starting to recognize. So if we want it to be better, all of us, should try to figure out how do we create something new for the future using, what we've learned. But this is going to be new. Similar group of people. We'll probably have the same budget. We may have some of the same customers, but we're going to try to reinvent ourselves every year, reinventing ourselves. And I believe that organizations who can figure that out, those are the ones who are going to grow. Those who keep trying to look back. When you tell me, and I got to cut this off because I feel myself talking too long, but when you tell me as a Black person in the United States, you've been in business for 137 years, that rings differently for me. Because 137 years ago, you probably wouldn't have sold anything to me and might have tried to sell me. So that's not don't tell me that. That doesn't help me. When you say it used to be good years ago, that doesn't ring well for me because it wasn't good for me at the time. I'm not saying it wasn't for you, but it wasn't for me. So if you want to get me in, let's talk about what we can do going forward, not try to convince me how all your history and your background is so important, because it wasn't for me because I wasn't there.
That element of change is such a core part of this, of organizations thinking about psychological health and safety. And it's a bigger piece than even, I think, many of us have been talking about, even in the last, 5, 6 years, 7 years, as we've been talking about psychological health and safety in a more, with bigger volume. And the knowing that this is change work and then managing, because everything's dynamic as well. So it's change work to get to a place where we are more adaptable and flexible so that we can change. So learning to change more often is a piece of it, but also the dynamics that are important to psychological health and safety, because things are always changing. And so it is not a once and done, some of the pieces, it is working within that dynamic.
You make me think of a quote by the great Arthur Ashe, who said, "Success is not a destination, it is a journey." Mm-hmm. You don't ever get there. You're just you're on the way all the time. You're always on the way. And there's this belief out there that we can get there. You don't ever get there. You're just going there. So that's a part of the communication I think we need to have. You don't ever become psychologically healthy and safe. You're always working towards being psychologically healthy and safe because it's going to change. Even if it's just the three of us. I've had the honor and pleasure of being in a committed relationship with the same person for 36 years, and we married 35 years ago. And we're not the same people. We're not. We are not the same people. We are different. And we have chosen to remain in a relationship with these new people, this new person that keeps popping up every 6 months or a year. We decide to stick because some parts of this new person, my spouse probably doesn't like. But the parts that she does, she sticks in there with me. So it's always, we're on this journey together. It's a journey. It's not, you don't ever get it perfect. It's a journey. We're going to change, and that's okay.
What I hear from you also is that this is a new strategic. It's not extra work. It's a core piece of work. And that's another perhaps conversation with organizations. We're in, you and I have talked about this, but being in the phase of early adoption and that sort of the innovators who are ready to change or see the conditions and see the value, or at least have an inkling, like that there is value there. I need to learn more, or I need to change because of something else. And this might be part of that change, but at its core, it's strategic work.
It is.
And it's a strategic priority, just as financial health in an organization is managed and the risk is managed around that. So that's kind of how I see it. And I hear that from you too. So it's doing something different until it's not different anymore. Until this is the way we do business here.
Yeah.
This is the way we do business here. And that is part of the conversation with leaders today, which is it isn't extra emotional labor to do this extra work. It is doing it differently, as you say, rethinking every year strategically, or realigning things, restructuring, recommitting to different priorities, and doing it so that functionality and that adaptability is actually part of our skill set. It's part of our skill set, and we're doing it, and and now it's part of the way we do business.
Yeah,
which
I'm going to remember that one though. Doing something different till it's not different anymore. So
till it's not different anymore. It's just the way to create positive habits. It's like doing something different. So, what has been the most rewarding for you as the host of the podcast?
The most rewarding part has been connecting people who, in some cases, didn't even know each other, that were doing, various parts of this work, and being able to connect and helping build this community of people who are interested in the topic. As I said, I've just met some really, really interesting and exciting people. I have, as a matter of fact, it would be episode 51, I believe, the last episode of the last season, so to speak. I brought 3 people on. One, I was just meeting for the first time. 2 were actually return guests, and I've only had a couple of return guests. One has this depth of expertise around auditing and occupational health and safety, and I met her through some of my professional affiliations, and she was the first Black person I'd met who knew what a psychosocial hazard was, and didn't got to roll her eyes and say, "What is that?" Another person is someone I met through, I think we met on LinkedIn, who has a background as a chief people officer in big corporations and whatnot, and ended up being burned out and has her own podcast and business and all that, who's involved on one of the technical committees that, from an HR perspective, that advises the folks who do 45,003. And then I met this guy who was actually on the committee that wrote 45,003. And these 3 people. So when the podcast started, I had no idea that people like this lived in the United States, because I didn't think we had any involvement whatsoever. And they actually do. We actually have some people who know the standard, who know the science, who know the back. They know more about the standard itself, certainly even than I do. But to be able to get these 3 people together at the same time and have a dialogue amongst them, a couple of them have even, met up after because they were at a conference together. That's rewarding to me. It's rewarding because there's a part of me that wonders, had not this podcast existed, those 2 people may not have met, at least when they did. So that's very rewarding, because I see more of those, again, people that have been guests that are meeting each other, and they reach out to each other and have their own kind of conversations. Now, ultimately, I think this ought to be ubiquitous. We got to be talking about it everywhere. I don't have to be involved in a conversation. I'm happy to, but it's just getting the word out and getting people to understand that this is the fundamental safety issue we should be talking about before we talk about the others, is this one. Because if we focus on this one, we'll solve a lot of the others. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more on that. Given that, and you just sort of referenced it, that we know that every jurisdiction in the world is at a different place with psychological health and safety, or protecting mental health in the workplace, and different versions, some voluntary, some legislation. We know we have to give a shout out to Australia, because they are the head head of the pack in terms of regulation, compliance, inspections, and reporting. And because from a country perspective, you're thinking about it, where are we, and who's helping to make change happen? What keeps you hopeful and optimistic? Even in the absence, I guess, of those explicit regulations as Australia has, and we don't have them either. But what keeps you hopeful, David?
What keeps me hopeful is the fact that here in the U.S. we really want to believe us to be the number one at everything. That's what we believe. We're not, but we love to believe it. And often the way we evaluate our whether or not we're good or bad at something is to look at how we compare to other people. So I believe that the establishment of an international standard, the fact that folks are talking more about ESG, about environment and social governance conversations, that we're having more discussions about the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, that the World Health Organization has come out with this whole conversation around mental health, that our Surgeon General has weighed in on the topic. And we have lots of businesses who started here in the United States, that have presence all around the world. And frankly, because they want to make money, and I've had a few of them reach out to me and say, hey, we've just acquired a company that has a presence in Australia, and we don't know much about that psychological health and safety thing. Can you help? I think all of those things are going to get us there, and they're going to get us there quicker than places like Canada. Because when you all started, nobody else had a standard at all. You had to start from scratch.
I know. 2013. Well, I think it started in 2009. I think if you look at some of the perfect storm and the research and all of those folks who did that.
And that was hard. That was hard. It's hard to start something from scratch without a reference, but we get the benefit now of the U.S. that we don't have to start from scratch. We can watch what you've done in Canada, what's gone on in Australia, what's gone on in the UK and the other 27 countries around the world, as my friend Ellen Pinkos-Cobb says in her book, that we don't have to start from scratch in the U.S. And I think we can actually move forward a lot quicker because of the work that other countries have done. So that's what really makes me hopeful. And I also believe that the conversations that are being had at places like the National Safety Council and like the American Society for Safety Professionals and like the National Association of Safety Professionals, these safety-related groups who are having the conversation about the connection between safety, diversity, equity, inclusion, psychological, they're making this connection to all of the ways in which we've, left out the silent safety hazards. All of those discussions, all going on at the same time, make me hopeful that we're going to be further down the road in a couple of years than we are today.
If you could give, advice to any organization in the United States, recognizing that there are legal minimums for certain things, definitely on the extreme ends. Probably, I know they're very similar to Canada in that we are protected on some of the sort of the extreme end of certain things that can happen inside a workplace, negative things that can happen. What one piece of advice would you give to a organization that has found out about psychological health and safety and is considering, well, what can and should we do? What's like the first action that you would recommend that they do?
The first action I think people should consider is to accept that psychosocial hazards are real. This is sometimes like having a conversation about the moon landing. Did it really happen for some people? Because there are those who just don't believe that it's real. If I can't see the blood or the bone sticking through or have the person clutching their chest because of the heart, I don't believe it because I can't see it. This exists whether you see it or not. And the reality is the quicker you accept that it exists, the quicker you will start to see it. So just believe people when they tell you that this doesn't feel safe to them, they're being exposed to a psychosocial hazard. That's why I say it doesn't feel right. What is it? I'm not sure. I don't feel right. Take that qualitative data that they're providing for you and accept it exists. It's a thing. And it's something you can do something about. And the quicker you do something about it, the easier it is to do something about. Accept that psychosocial hazards are real. That's it. Because once you can get past that, then I'd say, well, now treat this hazard like you do all the others. What would you do if people told you that there was something that was on fire in your building? What would you do if someone told you that it is flooding or that someone was electrocuted or someone's exposed to a chemical? Would you just stand there and go like, well, I don't really believe it. I know they're having a seizure, but it can't be real. You would do something because now you see it. Accept it. It's real. And now try to figure out how vulnerable are we to this thing? And the vulnerability is, how much is this thing going to limit our ability to do what we really want to do, which is whatever, make money, make great products, hire great people, because
change the world,
whatever. I mean,
yes.
Psychosocial hazards are relative. I mean, they exist whether you see them or not, and they're having an effect on you whether you want to accept it or not. The question is now, what do you want to do about that? Because some of these, you can't do anything. You can't. In the fire rescue service, there was nothing we could do to stop tornadoes from showing up or flood. You can't earthquakes from happening. You can't stop it. So you have to get prepared for it. There are some things that are going to happen in your line of business, but are you prepared for it when it does? Have you prepared the people in your organization when it does? And being honest about that. That's a part of being honest with people is being honest that these things exist. We've at least thought about them. And we have a kind of a plan when they happen. And if none of us understands it, I'm not sure why we're in this business.
Then I think that notion of acceptance as a practice of what exists, it is a practice in work. And people, I think that's why early adopters and innovators are some of the organizations and organizational leaders that are starting to explore psychological health and safety. We always have innovators and early adopters in almost anything. And then their practice and work can help support others from going forward. And then all of our work will be done. It will be like, then we'll have done all the work. David, thank you so much for all of your thoughts, ideas today. And if our listeners would like to reach out to you, how could they get in touch with you?
Well, there are a couple of easy ways to get in touch with me. I take email from virtually anybody if they send it to the right one. My email is david at id2-solutions.com. You can go to my website, id2-solutions.com. We are available to help folks out. And they can also, follow our, edition of this, same conversation at Psych Health and Safety USA.com. You can find, some of the conversations we've been having over the last year relative to psychological health and safety. And it's pretty easy. I'm pretty open. Always happy to have conversations with people who are interested in the topic.
Great. Thanks for that. And thanks everyone for listening in from wherever you're listening and get your podcasts. And you can also go to the Flourish DX YouTube channel for the podcast and subscribe, and get a chance to see the full episodes and get to watch them, not just listen to them. And thanks for being here and listening in. And also invite you to check out other episodes in the podcast. And thank you, David, for being my guest today on the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. And look for David and check out the Psych Health and Safety in the US podcast as well. And have a great rest of your day. And hopefully you'll tune in again. Thanks. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.